All right. Well, good evening, everyone. We are delighted to have you, and you are the first ones, and we hope that many more will follow your lead. As I'm looking over the names and guests, we have an international flavor tonight. We have Canada represented as well as various places within the U.S. And we are so glad that you've taken the time to be with us at the Friends of Israel and Zionist Organization of America tonight. And we have a wonderful event, and I'm very much looking forward to sharing our evening with you. Just in case you're wondering, you can see my name is Tim Munger. I am with Friends of Israel and here in the Detroit area. And tonight's event is co-sponsored between the Friends of Israel and the Zionist Organization of America.
Okay.
And let me just introduce quickly our representatives and guests from ZOA. We have as our speaker tonight, just going across the top, we have as our speaker, Dan Pollak. And very much looking forward to hearing his view on the topic that we've selected for him to address, and that is the U.S.-Israel relationship, its strengths and weaknesses. So welcome, Dan. Sheldon Freilich is the president of ZOA here in Detroit, and the Michigan director of ZOA here is Kobe Eretz. And you'll be hearing from them just in a couple of minutes. Just in a couple housekeeping things. First of all, we're going to be taking a very simple and non-professional poll. We just wanted to know, how did you hear about tonight's event? And so you'll see the poll on the screen, and you can, it's in the chat room, I think. And you can tell us how you heard about tonight's event, A, through ZOA, B, through Friends of Israel, C, through friend or family member, or as Dan pointed out, you may have heard, realized that your phone call was being monitored by the NSA. And so there you go. But we'd love to know how you got to hear about tonight's event and got to be with us. Second, through the evening, if you'd like to be able to donate, you can do that. You can hit the donate button. It will take you to either Michigan ZOA, mizoa.org, and you can donate there. And you can also go to the Friends of Israel at foi.org at our website, and you can hit the donate button and donate there. We hope you'll be want to make that as easy for you as we can.
All right,
allow me to introduce to you our co-sponsors of tonight, Sheldon and Kobe. Good evening, Kobe and Sheldon. Sheldon, we'll start with you and then go to Kobe. And please tell us about yourselves and ZOA, would you please?
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this exciting, very interesting event. I think you'll find Dan Pollak's knowledge and insights amazing. We appreciate everybody here and everybody's support for Israel. Zionist Organization of America is actually the U.S.'s oldest pro-Israel organization. We're 120 years old, and we've been fighting for security for Israel and for the Jewish people. And we fight and promote the importance of the strategic relationship between Israel and the United States, which is incredibly important and valuable to Israel and to us as Americans, to the United States. The United States gets as much value from that relationship, far exceeding the aid that the United States provides to its pro-democratic ally in the Middle East, Israel, the only democratic ally in the Middle East.
That's true.
We welcome all your support of Israel. I'm a Detroit native. My parents were Holocaust survivors. They came to this country after the Holocaust, right before I was born. So I attribute a lot of my passion and Jewish identity and passion for Israel from my parents and my family. As I mentioned, I'm a native Detroiter. Spent a long time in the healthcare industry and as a nonprofit executive, and I've been on the board of Zionist Organization of America Michigan region for over 20 years, and we appreciate your support. I'm going to turn it over to our executive director, Kobe Ayers. Kobe.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kobe Ayers. I'm the director for ZOA Michigan. Thank you, Tim and Chris, for all that you do. Thank you for hosting us. Tim, we've known each other for a few years, and we're lucky to have you as a friend of Israel. And if everybody here in FOI shares your passion, then you are our friends as well. So just a little bit about myself. I was born and raised in Jerusalem, in Israel, and I went to school there, went to high school there. I served for 3 years in the IDF. 1 second. And I'm sorry about that. So, and so I served for 3 years in the IDF and moved to the US in 2011. Now, my dream is always to go back. Israel is our land, and even though I'm here, we're doing the work that is needed here. Our goal is always to go back. We actually, as a religious Jew, I pray to go back to Israel 3 times every day, morning, afternoon, and evening. Part of our job at ZOA is really to stand up for Israel and fight anti-Semitism. Now, if you notice, if you watch the news, anti-Semitism, there is a surge in anti-Semitism, the biggest surge since the Holocaust. If you look at the campuses, if you look in the media, Israel is demonized. Jewish people are demonized. Israel is pressured by the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Just recently, just a little example, Ben & Jerry's stopped selling their products in Judea and Samaria. Judea and Samaria, as you know, is an integral part of the Jewish state, Jewish land. King David was there, King Saul was there, King Solomon was there, and all of the Jewish heroes were there. We are fighting the battle on many fronts. Like I said, on college campuses, Iran is pushing for a nuclear program and vows to destroy Israel. And if there's anything that we've learned from the past is that when somebody says that they want to destroy the Jewish state and the Jewish people, we have to take them seriously. We've seen it in Germany, we've seen it in other places, and we see it now with Iran. And now if you look, you can see that most of the world is silent. And really it's our job to go out there and to stand up for truth. We played a major role in moving the American embassy to Jerusalem. We played a major role in having the US recognize the Golan Heights as an Israeli territory. And we are fighting the two-state solution. We believe that the land of Israel it belongs to the Jewish people. And as a religious Jew, I fully believe that God gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people, and this is why, for those who come with an ideology, a strong ideology, no argument can steer us away. So about you guys. So Israel has many friends. Israel has many friends, and I want to thank you. And it's not just me that thanks you. If you look at the Bible, if you look at the Torah, it says in Hebrew, I'm going to say it. It says that Ani avarech et ele shevachu etchem, that God will bless those who bless you, and vice versa. So you don't have only my thanks, but you have also the thank of God. Dan Pollak is our he basically he runs our business in Washington D.C. There's a lot of work to be done there, and we're going to hear from him in a second. On December 19th, we're going to have the ZOA Gala. It's a national gala. We're also honoring people from Michigan. We're going to have Mike Pompeo there. We're going to have Naftali Bennett, the Prime Minister of Israel, and Miriam Edelson, and many others. We hope you can join us. You can visit our website. It's going to be on tomorrow. Like Michigan, mizoa.org. We are at a cross points in history. It's been 2,000 years that the Jews have been in exile, and just like and I feel comfortable saying it here with a religious organization, we are back in the land. The Jewish people are back in the land after 2,000 years. I am a testimony to kind of the what looks like the Jewish history. So my grandparents come from my father's side come from Iraq, from Baghdad, and the parents my grandparents from my mother's side come from Eastern Europe, and they all come originally from Jerusalem. So now we're here. We can use their help. You out there fighting for truth, fighting for Israel, and I believe that with the help of God, together we will thrive and we will make Israel grow. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dan Pollak to take it over, and looking forward to hearing from you, Dan.
Dan, you can unmute. Welcome, Dan.
Tim, are you going to say something, or should I go ahead?
I just want to say one thing, and that is that Dan is our guest speaker, and he is the director for ZOA on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., interacts regularly with our government leaders. And so we're delighted to have Dan. He has an extensive background. He got his BA from University of Miami of Ohio and graduated from there with a degree in mathematics, also served in the military and the Navy. Went through graduate school there in nuclear communications, nuclear engineering. And so Dan, it's our pleasure and privilege to have you tonight. We are eager to hear from you on the topic of Israel and the US in our relationship, its strengths and weaknesses. Welcome, Dan. We are delighted to have you. The mic is yours.
Thank you so much. I first wanted to show off my tie, which has it says it's got the sunset of Jerusalem, much like Sheldon's background. And it says, "Pray for the peace of Jerusalem," with a big Jewish star. And it's actually bought it from a church, I believe. So I wanted to start out by saying the strength of Israel in Washington, D.C. is directly attributable to Christian Zionists, far more than it is to Jews. So we thank you all for being engaged on this issue. It makes the difference. It's not an accident that America, a super powerful country, is the only country in the world to still have a great deal of Christian belief in our country that is at a level that can help support the Jewish people. And we really appreciate it. And I don't think it's an accident. I wanted to start out with a little joke. I hope everyone takes it in the spirit that it's intended. It's not supposed to be literal. It turns out that the director of the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., heard that in Israel, in the Jerusalem Zoo, that they were keeping the lion and the lamb in the same cage. And he didn't think this could be true. As everyone knows, lions are carnivores, but he wanted to find out about it himself. So he flies to Israel, asks for a meeting with the director of the National Zoo in Israel. And the guy wants to put him off. He doesn't want to give away the secret, but after numerous efforts, he finally gets a meeting with him. And he asks him point blank the question, how can you keep the lion and the lamb in the same cage? And the answer given by the Israeli is obvious when you think about it. They put a new lamb in every morning. And the reason for telling this story is that it's really important to both your group and to ours that Israel not be the sacrificial lamb in the Middle East. It's not going to be somebody that's going to be eaten by its neighbors. We're not going to allow that. So before I start, I always want to talk to people who, when you watch the news, you get maybe the wrong idea, and I wanted to put it in a local context. Israel is not a big country. It's often assumed to be so by how important it's viewed in the news. It's 1/11 the size of Michigan in square miles.
Wow.
And if you want to think about it, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan is twice as big in area as Israel. It's really a small country. Say again? So there are some tough times in the US-Israeli relationship. It's really important to me to not repeat things that everyone hears. And you've all probably pretty well informed, but there's a risk at that. If I assume knowledge that someone doesn't have, I want you to make a note of it and ask me about it during the question and answer. So I'm going to go through and try not to tell you the same things you've always heard, try to tell you something different. But if I skip over something or assume knowledge that you don't have, it's important to ask me to clarify it. The tough times are in some ways the result of the greatest possible events. The last 4 years, ending in this past January, were the greatest in the relationship between the United States and Israel in Israel's history, frankly. The United States, under former President Trump, just did thing after thing. It would actually take me most of the time I have allocated to cover all the great things that Kobe touched on that the United States and Israel did together during the last 4 years. It was a really good time. But elections have consequences, and now we have a different group running things. In many cases, the same people that were running things during the Obama administration. And while we don't hesitate to say the good things that occurred during the relationship between President Obama and Israel, for example, military cooperation continued all through that time, and the United States and Israel worked together in the development of new weapon systems. There's a lot of things we can talk about the positive aspects of the American-Israel relationship, but I think most of those are pretty common knowledge. I can cover them during questions if you have them. I do want to get questions from everyone. But I wanted to touch on some of the tough times that we're experiencing now and what those issues are, and then talk a little bit about the two-state solution and what's wrong with it and why American politicians seem to be obsessed with it. There are 4 things that in the last week and a half have emerged as major issues to the United States and Israel that are almost storm clouds on the horizon. First of all, President Biden ran on the promise that he would reestablish a consulate in Jerusalem to the Palestinian Arabs. And this is highly problematic. I assume most people on this call understand that Jerusalem has to be the undivided capital of Israel. It's the only place, only Jerusalem has ever been Israel's capital. And it's only Israel is the only place that Jerusalem has ever been a capital for. If you ever want to listen to our national president, Mort Klein, he actually gives an entire talk on how Jerusalem is not actually holy. It's not mentioned in the Quran at all in the Muslim religion. It's just a political fact that they have backfitted the idea that Jerusalem is a holy city to Islam. But it definitely is to Christianity and Judaism. And only under Israeli control have the holy sites of all faiths been allowed free access. But they want to open up this consulate that would just be to the Palestinian Arabs. And in no other city in the world does the United States have its embassy and a consulate in the same city. If you need consular work, like helping you to get a visa or something like that, in the capital city of any other country in the world, you go to the embassy, and they have a section of the embassy staff that deals with those issues. This consulate would only be to the Palestinian Arabs, and for some reason, it's not being planned on being located where the Palestinian Arabs have their government in the town of Ramallah. Instead, they want to place it in the middle of Jewish Jerusalem. we are strongly opposed. And in fact, right now we have a huge building-sized banner in Hebrew and English hanging from a hotel in Jerusalem that the ZOA has financed, which makes the point that it is unacceptable.
Well, that's better than no, I guess.
Yes. Number 2 issue, again, we can take questions on these in a few minutes. The communities in Judea and Samaria have a natural increase. They haven't even founded new communities under the new coalition government, which is a combination of left wing and right wing in Israel. Instead, they are allowing for some natural growth. At the same time, they've balanced it with additional building in Arab villages throughout Judea and Samaria. And the Biden administration has chosen, along with Europeans, to strongly object to this. And this is a real departure from American policy on the issue. Thirdly, the non-governmental organizations, there's 6 of them that have direct ties to terrorist groups, especially the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, that has a history of horrific terrorist attacks all through Israel and the world, actually. And there are 6 non-governmental organizations that actually employ the same people, share offices, and so on, that are directly linked to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And Israel took action to take sanctions on them as a result of their terrorist connections. And incredibly, the Biden administration has called Israel out on this and treating it as though it's an unfriendly act. And finally, there's Iran, which is always, as Kobe mentioned, lurking behind the only really serious major threat to Israel's actual survival is the idea that Iran could get a military nuclear capability. And the talks are going to resume at the end of this month, right after Thanksgiving. And we are very concerned about the direction they will go, because the United States' policy continues to be to return to the flawed so-called JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which would result at the end of its 10-year term in around 2026-27, in Iran being able to build a nuclear bomb with no restrictions at all. So those are the things that are the bad news about the American-Israel relationship. There's a lot of good news. I don't want to, Israel continues to supply all kinds of intelligence about what's going on in Iran and Iraq. The very intelligence that was used to help kill their terrorist mastermind, Soleimani, in January of this past year, December of last year, was probably provided by Israel. Israel doesn't talk a lot about those details, but they work very closely together with the United States. Everyone talks about the Iron Dome and how successful it is at shooting down incoming missiles, short-range missiles aimed at Israel, but the American Army is actually testing right now the Iron Dome technology for use to defend our troops when they go into the field. And that type of thing happens all the time. Finally, before I take questions, I wanted to just talk a little bit about the 2-state so-called solution. It's an offensive name. It isn't a solution to anything, but it's called the 2-state solution. And on its face, for those of you who don't know, it is that Israel, which already exists as a country, should continue to be a country, and then there should be a new Palestinian Arab country. The problem is that every new Arab country that's been created in the Middle East has followed a totalitarian model. There haven't been any democracies created, unfortunately. There are already 22 Arab countries. The need for a 23rd is not at all evident, and the territory that it would be supposedly founded on is Judea and Samaria, the historical homeland, as Kobe said, of the Jewish people. But worse than that, it doesn't solve anything. When you do opinion polls amongst the Palestinian Arabs, you find that some of them say that they want the establishment of a Palestinian Arab state, but none of them say that establishing a Palestinian Arab state would be the end of their grievances and allow them to live in peace with Israel. They actually say that Israel would have to be diminished or eliminated in order for there to be true peace. And so at the back of the entire plan is the so-called phased plan for Israel's destruction, which was actually enunciated by the PLO and Yasser Arafat when he was alive, which said we will accept the establishment of a state on whatever territory we can wrestle from Israel. Then they would make it into a terrorist entity and use it as a base to destroy the rest of Israel. And the Israelis and people like Kobe, who serve in the IDF, aren't standing for that. And therefore, that plan is not moving forward. So what does it mean that the United States would endorse this idea? Basically, it means Israel should make concessions even when the other side isn't going to make any concessions in return. They call these confidence building measures, and it doesn't provide me with any confidence at all. So I just wanted to address why this idea is so popular. I work with members of Congress and their staffs, trying to educate them on the realities of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And even though most members of Congress are pro-Israel and say so, all but a few will insist that they're pro-Israel, really. Many of them actually do want the establishment of a Palestinian Arab state, which we know what it would lead to because we see it in miniature in Gaza. Hamas, the terrorist group, controls Gaza, and it's not leading to any kind of peace. It leads to rockets. But members of Congress like to be seen, when you, as a constituent, ask them a question, they like to be seen in control and able to give you an answer about how they're going to solve a problem. If they admit that the so-called two-state solution doesn't lead to peace and doesn't lead to any solution, they would have to say what their idea is that's better. ZOA and Friends of Israel can enunciate that. It's a very complicated thing. It really amounts in the long term, just as we saw the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, and maybe Saudi Arabia in the future, certainly Morocco, joining formal ties with Israel. They have put behind them the long-term conflict as their highest priority and are seeking ways to live in peace with the people of Israel. And that is our hope that someday Palestinian Arabs will do too. Let me be frank, we're very far from that point. They're still teaching their children to hate us. Their textbooks in their schools still literally use the idea of terrorism in math problems, word problems, for example. They literally teach their kids in social studies that Haifa, which is Israel's largest port, is a city of Palestine without any idea that there's another country that resides there. So there's no teaching of the idea of living in peace. And until that changes, it's going to be a far date indeed. But in Congress, they don't like to admit that. And so individual members of Congress, including some from Michigan that I could name, I don't like to get personal, but you can go through various people, even some of whom consider themselves pro-Israel. For example, both of your senators consider themselves pro-Israel. Many of them have Jewish staffers. Some of them are Jewish themselves, for example. But what we're not seeing is the kind of understanding of the conflict that we see when we talk to Christian Zionists like yourself. And the problem is they have a weird balance. If you have a friend in a fight, you don't look for some kind of a weird balance between your friend who's getting beat up and the people who are trying to beat them up. There's not goodness on both sides. And that is what the politicians say. Whenever they say something good about Israel, they seek to balance it by trying to seek something equally good about Palestinian Arabs to say. And this is a fundamental flaw in the approach. Sometimes almost all the right is on one side or another. And that's really the case in the Arab-Israeli conflict. And when it comes to a two-state solution, that is not a solution because the other side has turned it down and will not make peace, even if they are allowed to establish a Palestinian Arab state. So I'm going to be looking forward to your questions. If there's anything I went through too quickly, I encourage you to ask that. I'll turn it over to Tim now to direct the rest of the program.
Dan, I appreciate your focusing on the two-state solution. and a couple of questions that I'd like to have you expand on. Let's start with this one. Where did the idea for the two-state solution begin?
That's actually a very interesting question. Many people don't know the answer to this. They don't realize that this is something that's been proposed since 1937, the Peel Commission. So it was already known. I mean, there was violence in, for example, Hebron. There was a major massacre in the 1920s, multiple massacres. It's particularly ironic, Hebron is one of my favorite examples. When it's in Judea and Samaria, it's normally thought of as an Arab city, but of course, it's one of the cities that was continuously lived in by Jews since biblical times. Mm-hmm. And there's always been a Jewish community there. And that was true until the horrible pogrom, the riots, the massacre that occurred in Hebron in the late 1920s, and ultimately during the Arab revolt against British rule in the 1930s. A great deal of blood was spread. Jewish blood was done by essentially terrorists who were misinformed and kept on being egged on by their political and religious leaders, and they just killed Jews indiscriminately. In order to stop the violence, the British established a commission called the Peel Commission. Again, I don't want to be boring with a history lesson. They proposed a partition of the existing land. Now, again, many people don't realize the original mandate for Palestine, which was what the British called the entire area of what is today Jordan and Israel, was established after World War I to be a homeland for the Jewish people. And arbitrarily in 1922, the British chopped it 3/4 of it to the country of Jordan, which they made into an Arab kingdom, and 1/4 of it stayed in what we now know as Israel, at that time called Palestine. And the partition they were talking about in the Peel Commission and all subsequent partitions have been over that 1/4 of the territory allocated to the Jewish people. So the idea is very old, goes back almost 100 years, and ironically, the Jews have accepted it at every step of the way. Again, it was accepted in the partition plan in 1947. The UN voted that there should be a Palestinian Arab state made up of much of what's now Judea and Samaria. Israel would only have been established along the coast and the Negev desert. And a lot of population centers that Israel has were to be instead a part of a Palestinian Arab state that was to have been founded in 1947 as well. But instead of accepting this, the Israelis accepted this truncated state. And instead of accepting it, the Arab armies invaded. And there have been 3 more times in peace negotiations where the two-state solution has been offered and turned down by the Arab side. It's time to understand that that isn't the way to solve anything. I hope that answered it.
It does. I think that's interesting to me because there was one presentation that said the reason there is no Palestinian state is because of a 2-letter answer. No.
That's true. And after the 1967 war, the Arab League met in Khartoum, Sudan, and they said 3 principles that stood them until very recently. No peace with Israel, no negotiation with Israel.
Tim Munger is doing a Zoom meeting about Israel tonight.
Okay. And Nathan, you might want to turn down your microphone. So the 3 famous no's of Khartoum: no peace, no negotiations, and the third one, I know it very well, but I'm having trouble remembering it. But basically, the answer was no. No to any in-person peace talks as well. So the no that has occurred, we can get into a very long discussion about the real reason for that. I personally believe, having studied Islam, is there is a large religious component of this as well. It is very difficult in Islam because they believe that God, they call God Allah, intervenes in every part of religious affairs, whereas Christians and Jews, we believe God is all powerful, but he allows a certain agency to people. So if we want to go and go against God's plan, it doesn't really work out in the long run, but people can certainly go in that direction. Whereas in Islam, every negative thing has to be explained. And the idea that an area that was once ruled by Islam has reverted to being a non-Islamic place is threatening to their basic theology. So it's not just Israel that they want to revert to being under the Islamic rule. If you talk to one, they also feel just as strongly that Spain, for example, should be ruled by Islam, because it used to be at one time. And it's a theological problem. So when you have a person who believes that, it's very difficult to negotiate a peace with them. I hope that answers it, Tim.
It does. It's interesting. There is and I believe it was Kissinger, but if not, it was an American politician, diplomat, who said that how do you make peace with someone who has sworn to your destruction?
It's quite true. And Golda Meir famously said, we can forgive the Arabs for killing our children, but we cannot forgive them for teaching their children to kill our children. There are so many things she said that were, it's really, they kill all hope for the future if they aren't really interested in finding a way. And that's why the hope of the Abraham Accords comes in. For the first time, we're seeing essentially a popular movement in the United Arab Emirates. It's beyond just the government. If you see, you can actually see videos being posted by Emirati families teaching their children to sing Hatikva, the Jewish national anthem, the Israeli national anthem. That is so heartwarming to a lover of Israel, teaching their children to fly the Israeli flag, just like you're doing in the background there, Tim. And that's really wonderful. And it gives me some hope. It's a long road, though.
It is. A couple other questions, since we're on this topic and it's prevalent. People say, okay, if this two-state solution is really unworkable, what would you recommend to replace the two-state solution?
It's a great question. And there's a very long, and we could probably have an entire program just on this, but in short, I would say that the Abraham Accords are the model. Down the road, Arabs in general, and in particular Palestinian Arabs, have to learn that their future is better having reached an accommodation with Israel. There's no, I mean, you look around the region, Lebanon has a problem with water and getting supplies of natural gas to actually generate electricity. There are blackouts. If they would actually allow their neighbor Israel to help them, it would really be better for the people of Lebanon. But they're under the horrible government of Hezbollah, and that's not something that's going to happen in the short term. There's country after country like that, where Israel and their unique blend of technology and can-do attitude really has produced miracles. They literally have a machine to make water from the atmosphere. And they can deploy this in a place where you have no water. And it's a matter of working with them, and it really can solve a lot of the problems of the region. So that's my hope for the future. But a lot of people, as I told you on the phone, Tim, when we were talking, they have this weird idea that it's easy to show that the two-state solution is not helpful. If you look at the opinion polls, as I said, it isn't going to result in a decrease in violence. And that should be enough reason to rule it out as the topic of discussion. So it seems to me that there's a logical error involved in saying, I have this horrible idea that isn't going to work, but until you can spell out a better plan, we're going to stick with that horrible idea because it's the only plan in town. It doesn't make any sense to me.
I would agree. One last question concerning, and then we'll turn it over to our chat room. And we've got several questions coming in that are excellent questions, Dan. Regarding Iran, it's the greatest threat that Israel faces, bar none. What motivation, how much is the Iranian factor the motivation for the Abrahamic Accords? Is that a factor in your opinion?
It seems to be huge. I mean, let's take a look at the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain. All of them are under direct threat from Iranian proxies or Iran itself. Iran is a hegemonic power, which is how political scientists say that means they want to take over their part of the world. They are looking to increase their power. When you speak to an Iranian, and this is actually a good thing, they're very proud of their past. We all know the story of Cyrus the Great in the Bible. Those of you who know the Bible, and I think that's most of the people on this call. Harry Truman liked to compare himself to Cyrus the Great because he is the one who allowed the Jewish people to return to Jerusalem after the Babylonian exile and rebuild the temple. But he was a great leader, and he was a leader of Persia. And they have a history of great empires and great leaders. But the problem is that they look at their modern equivalent of their country, and they see that it doesn't have the same influence that they think Persia traditionally had in that part of the world. And so they have kind of a grievance nationally that they want to return to a higher level of influence with the countries around them. The natural people who are opposed to this and their historical enemies are the Arab nation. And there is a natural rivalry between Arab and Persians. And that is a significant factor in the Abraham Accords. It's not the only one, however. Israel gets a lot of credit in the Arab world for standing up to Iran. Even when they hated Israel, they respected the way that Israel was fighting the both covert and overt battle against Iranian terror and expatriate activities. And so they got a lot of credibility by doing that. So it is a big part of it. In my opinion, it's just one piece of the puzzle. The leaders, let's not forget, the UAE is still it's not a democracy, it's still a dictatorship. And so Saudi Arabia too. And they are looking to stay in power. They have small royal families that have immense power, and it's based on hereditary power. And they're looking to stay in power, and they view an alliance with Israel as making them seem stronger, both the intelligence assets that I talked about in the United States relationship and the military strength. I mean, the Arabs can buy military equipment, and Saudi Arabia and UAE has spent a lot of money on it. But let's be honest, their military capabilities do not compare to Israel's, regardless of how modern the weapons that they buy are. And therefore, Israel is a strong horse in the region, and that's a very big factor in the reason they want to continue with the Abraham Accords.
It's interesting to me because in Psalm 120, Dan, as we look at Israel, Palestinian situation, Israel and the threat of Iran, in Psalm 120, it's what I call the Psalm of the modern state of Israel. And it's a pilgrim psalm sung on your way to Jerusalem. It's the introduction to the pilgrim psalms sung on your way to Jerusalem. And the psalmist ends Psalm 120 with the tension that you've described tonight. When I speak, I am for peace. But when they speak, they are for war. And therein is the issue. Dan, it's been a pleasure to have you. We got more questions coming. If you have a question for our guest speaker, Dan.
Can I make a comment on Psalm 120?
You may.
Those of you who go to Jerusalem, and I hope you go again, those of you who have been, I was privileged in my last trip right before the pandemic. I was actually one of the last flights out of Ben Gurion Airport before they closed it, actually. We visited, they have excavated the actual path that people took from the bathing pools where they would be ritually purified as a pilgrim to Jerusalem. And it's about a mile, I'd say, the walk from the pools up to the temple. And they have actually excavated it, and it's a working place. And I was privileged to go there. And you're all going to have the opportunity in the near future, if not when Jerusalem opens up again to tourists, to physically walk the path. And there's no doubt that Jesus tread on this path. It is from the Second Temple period, and it is the actual stones that all of these pilgrims, when they came to Jerusalem, would sing that song.
How much of the path did you see excavated?
How much of it?
How much of the excavated that you've seen?
We have a video on our website. I'll try to make sure it's featured, but there's it's a great deal of it is being excavated. And we had to wear hard hats because it was still a working zone. We actually saw the little bags of earth that are removed. The way they do it at an archaeological site, they sift all the dirt that they take out when they dig in. They sift through to see if there are any artifacts that are too small for the workers to have seen. And so there's this big pulley of bags of dirt being carried up from where they're digging to the site where they're collecting and sifting through these bags. And you had to actually duck your head to avoid being hit by them as they're coming up. But the Herodian Stone, which is a distinctive type of architecture that was all part of the temple complex, is right there that you're walking on. And they've cleared to that thing for hundreds of yards. I don't know the exact distances. So you can easily see it on YouTube if you look up the Pilgrim's Path in Jerusalem. And it's going to be a tourist place that all of you are going to have the opportunity to visit, and I think very popular in the near future.
Just as a sidebar, go ahead, Shal.
I was just going to say that Israel has reopened to tourism. Tourists are more than welcome to travel to Israel. However, proof of vaccination is a requirement to travel there.
Okay. That's good news. It's been a long time. We have 4 tours a year. 2 are serving tours at Friends of Israel. 2 are general tours where you get to go and visit the land. And we have been hamstrung in our tours due to COVID. So we look forward to that day when that can open. But what I was going to say, in light of the excavations as you described them, our technical director tonight, Chris Katulka, headed our youth program that went to Israel, goes to Israel. It's called Origins. Our resolve is giving Israel never-ending support. Origins. And Chris, in his group one year, they actually found a coin from the Alexander the Great era, the Greek era. And so they discovered a coin. And I told Chris in an email, I said, God let that drop just so you could find it 2,000 years later. More questions.
It is something to see the real, when you go to, they've excavated, anyone who's been there recently, the City of David. I recommend that as well. And you can actually see probably what was the palace complex of King David in the First Temple period. And they've excavated it. It's really quite remarkable.
In the past year or so, there have been incredible excavation finds. Dan, this has been great. And just a reminder, if you'd like to donate, you can go to either of our organizations, mizoa.org or foi.org. You can donate there. We'd love to have you do that. And we are grateful for your input. Any questions you have, drop them in the chat, and we'll make sure Dan gets the opportunity to answer it. Dan, here's our first one from Huge Greenstein. Does the present government of Israel have the backbone to stand up to the pressure of the Biden administration, given the aid Israel gets from the U.S.?
Wow. I know Huge personally, and I will never forgive him for giving me such a politically incorrect question. Thanks, Huge. It's a very difficult question to answer. We in ZOA, and I'm sure you, really don't like to criticize the Israeli government. In particular, Prime Minister Bennett's going to be speaking at this gala we talked about, and I would hate for anything I said to cause him to be so mad at us. It appears that they are going to stand up at least a little bit. The Prime Minister and the other partner in his coalition, Lapid, who's currently the foreign minister, they both put out a statement that regarding the consulate, that they object to it. And technically, the United States cannot open the consulate without the permission of the Israelis. However, I have to be honest. I'm always honest in questions. I have grave doubts about the ability, as I think Huge does in asking the question, of the Israeli government to stand up to the United States. Their highest priority of this new government is to reverse the Bibi Netanyahu policy of having a somewhat contentious relationship with any United States government, and in particular the Democratic Party. And they are making great efforts to make it so that there's no problem between the United States and Israel. And Biden has made a campaign promise that he's going to do this, and therefore the pressure that he can exert on the Israeli government is very great indeed. Now that they've passed the budget in Israel, those of you who know the details, that makes the coalition government that they have much less vulnerable to falling, and that just happened in the last couple of days. And therefore, the excuse that Biden was not going to put the pressure on too hard is no longer present. And we expect very hard American pressure on each of these four things I talked about. And it is an open question how well the Israeli coalition government can resist it. They say that they won't divide Jerusalem and they won't open up a consulate there, but stand by. We hope that that's true, and we have some doubts. I hope that answers the question. But you know how difficult it is for me to criticize the actual Israeli government. That's just not what we do.
Many times I try and remind people who criticize Israel, it's like pretty easy for us to criticize. We don't have to live with the decision.
That's right. We keep that in mind all the time. People like Kobe, who serve in the IDF, and they get to vote in Israeli elections. And we can give good advice, and ZOA does, but we're always conscious of the limits of that type of advice.
It was a good answer, Dan.
Thank you, Huge.
Dan,
Next question we have, go ahead, Shel.
if I could just jump in and
Please.
just sort of follow up with what Dan said. The reopening or opening a consulate, a Palestinian consulate in Jerusalem, is really the first step for the Palestinians to designate Jerusalem as their capital and to divide Jerusalem into a Jewish and Palestinian city. That's how dangerous it is. And it's incredibly important to write not only the Biden administration, but your congressmen to block this. We've had a number of congressmen and senators come out against it, and it's important for the public, for them to hear from the American public about how serious and dangerous this is.
I agree with that completely. Let me just say, there is a bill in the Senate, and there's going to be one in the House soon. The Senate bill, it has a very long title, but you can find it on the ZOA website, the national website, zoa.org. But both of your senators in Michigan did not co-sponsor it. Unfortunately, only Republicans co-sponsored this legislation. And in the House, 200 House Republicans signed a letter that Lee Zeldin wrote. The law that is in the Senate would prohibit the spending of US money on any such consulate in recognition of the United States official policy that there should only be one Jerusalem, undivided. So anyway, I completely agree with Shel on that. Please contact them. That will make my job easier. Next question, if you have, Tim.
We have Ben Vasquez, and he has a series of good questions. I'm going to take them one at a time, and we'll get others involved.
I'll try to be short. I tend to be too long-winded on my answers.
It's all right. That's what we're here for. We're here to hear from you. So it's That's A-OK. Ben says, or I should say, ask, do you believe, Dan, we will see other countries sign on to the Abraham Accords? What do you think about that?
Well, almost certainly. The big prize here is Saudi Arabia, which I think is a good argument that if the Trump administration had continued, we would already have seen that by now. But there are complications there. The Biden administration has many friends at the Washington Post, and they are running a campaign basically because of this guy who has been assassinated by the Saudi secret police, essentially. I'm not saying Saudi Arabia is a great country. They did kill this guy, but he really wasn't a journalist. It's Khashoggi is normally called a journalist. He was actually an anti-Israel Muslim Brotherhood person. He was, if you don't know what that means that he was part of the same group that was trying to take over Egypt. They're trying to overthrow the Saudi monarchy. They're very, very anti-Semitic, and he was himself. In fact, the opinion pieces he wrote for the Washington Post were not, he didn't speak English well enough to write English. He would write his opinion pieces that were published in the Washington Post, and they were translated by the embassy of Qatar. We literally know that's true. People can tell this from the so-called metadata in the Word file that he submitted to the Washington Post. And so they were literally translated from Arabic by the Qatari embassy. The Qataris are the worst actors besides Iran in the region. But the answer is yes, there will be others. One of the questions is Sudan joined, but they just had a coup. It's unclear if that will last. You know, it's always a problem when you have non-democratic forms of government. What happens when you have a change of government? Do the ideas still stay? But the biggest successes, of course, are UAE, Morocco, Bahrain, and we have every reason to expect that there will be others. Some other countries that aren't Arab but are Muslim have enunciated, including Albania and Bangladesh, that they're considering steps. Everyone should know about the Iraqi effort. Unfortunately, the people who did it are now being prosecuted, but they had a meeting where they said, why is Iraq in a hostile relationship with Israel? And they basically advocated that Iraq should join the Abraham Accords. Now, that's not going to happen because, unfortunately, the Iraqi government is very much under the thumb of Iran, and Iran won't allow that. There are Shiite influences present. But these are Sunni Iraqis who met to try to say that, what is the reason that Iraq and Israel should be at war still? And so I do believe it will happen, just not very quickly now. And the big prize is Saudi Arabia. And ironically, the more critical the United States is of Saudi Arabia, in my opinion, the conventional wisdom is that will delay the relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia because they're mad at the United States. They won't do America a favor by getting closer to Israel. But ironically, I think actually Israel is the one ally that the Saudis can count on now, as the United States is increasingly hostile, and that actually might push them in that direction. The big holdup with Saudi Arabia is the old king. The king he's allowing his son to run most of the country, but he has a few ideas that he doesn't want to backtrack on, and one of them is hostility to Israel. So if he should pass away, that might enable things to move forward with the Saudi Arabia-Israel relationship.
In light of your answer, Dan, I've been thinking about this. Can you give us maybe 2-3 books that would be helpful for our guests to do their own reading and research in the area of Israel, the Abrahamic Accords,
Sure.
Israel's relationship to Iran, so on? What are some sources that you could recommend?
Yeah, I would have made sure I had the authors and titles exactly right if I had prepared this, but I didn't. So I'm just off the top of my head. One book that I think everyone should read is my favorite book about the history of Zionism, which I think would be generally appealing to all of you. It's called The Siege, and it's written by a guy named Connor Cruz O'Brien. He passed away. He was an Irish diplomat who sat next to Israel in the 1980s and in the UN. And of course, unfortunately, Ireland is one of the most hostile countries in Europe to Israel today, because weirdly, the country of Ireland seems to identify with the Palestinian Arabs instead of with the Jews in their anti-colonial fight against Britain. But Conor Cruz O'Brien actually lived through some of those times himself as a young man, and he recognized in talking with Abba Eban, who sat next to him, the Israeli ambassador to the UN, that he recognized the parallels between Irish history and Jewish history here. So it's a great book. It ends, it's called The Siege. It's a history of Zionism, basically. The more current books, I have a friend, Jonathan Schanzer, who just wrote a book about the May War. I can't remember the title of it, if anybody has it in front of them, but basically the war between Gaza, Hamas, and Israel. And it's a very good book. There are many, many books written by people who, conventional wisdom. And what none of these books do is account for the Abraham Accords. Most of the books on the Middle East have the mistaken idea that the Arab-Israeli conflict, and in particular the Palestinian-Arab conflict with Israel, is at the center and the key to all conflict in the Middle East. Nothing could be further from the truth. So you need to actually read books like my friend Jonathan Schanzer's, he's with the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. And it really kind of demonstrates, any book on the Abraham Accord, the articles by our former ambassador, David Friedman, are very helpful. So if you can find anything written by him, he's really explaining about what was accomplished during the Trump administration, what the battles were. I can't wait to read his actual memoir, which I believe he's writing, but it's not quite out yet. And I would read articles by our former ambassador, and also the Israeli ambassador to the US, Michael Oren, who isn't 100% in sync with ZOA's positions and maybe with the Friends of Israel's positions on each issue, but he is extremely realistic about the actual problems with the American-Israel relationship. So I would recommend his latest book. Again, I don't have the title in front of me.
Is that Ally?
It may be. I don't know the name of it. It could be, yes. I believe so, but I'm not 100% sure. I could be getting it confused with another one. I think somebody should look it up and validate that offline. I'm not able to do that right now.
Dan, let's move on to another question. Ben, I'll come back to your other question. Nicole Davis asked a very probing one. In fact, another person asked the very same question. So we have two of the same. Why does it seem that a lot of American Jews don't support Israel?
This is absolutely the most common question I ever get in front of Christian groups. Christian Zionists like yourselves, who are so important to supporting Israel, they look at the Jewish community and they're kind of amazed and flabbergasted. They don't support Israel. They don't necessarily support candidates who support Israel. They don't seem to view it as a particular positive that a particular candidate has done many, many good things for Israel, or a particular politician. The answer is, I want to be very careful here because I don't want to be accused of being an anti-Semite myself. There are segments of the Jewish community in America to which traditional Jewish values are not very important. I don't know how a better way to say that is. And all of the people who are from the Michigan ZOA are kind of nodding because they experience this every day. We are not, unfortunately, the ZOA is not the majority of the American Jewish community. I think we're pretty strong in the Orthodox community, but in the less observant parts of the American Jewish community, frankly, liberal social values are much more important, and especially the abortion question. I have literally had Jewish people tell me that they don't care what a politician does for Israel if they're not pro-abortion rights. What can I say about that? I think it speaks for itself as for the moral depravity involved and the departure, to anyone who knows Jewish religious thought, the departure from traditional Jewish values. There's a thing called repairing the world in Hebrew, tikkun olam, which if you ever speak to an Orthodox Jew, it is a precept, but it's been completely changed by so-called progressive Jews into being essentially the liberal agenda, both domestically and internationally. And it is not what Judaism stands for, actually. So the sad answer is that a new faith has come, in my view, to replace our traditional Jewish faith. I'm not a particularly observant person myself, I hate to admit, especially in front of a group of religiously observant people like yourselves. I know that if I were Orthodox, like Kobe is, and observant, that I would have more credibility. But the truth is, I'm a secular Jew, like many American Jews. The difference is I am in touch with our people's heritage and what it means to be a Jew. So I don't abandon our traditional values, even if I'm not that observant myself. And there are people in ZOA like that, like myself, but most secular American Jews, frankly, have other priorities that are more important to them than Israel, and frankly, more important to them than Judaism. The one thing that I don't allow them to say, and I just want to say this, is that one can be a perfectly good Jew and not care about Israel. As you people who read the Bible know, that isn't true. And I often think on the line about when a person speaks in particular about abandoning the Jewish position in Jerusalem, I wonder if their right hand is withering. And you know, all know the reference. It's something that
sticking to the roof of their mouth.
Yes. And yet they do it and they claim that they're doing it in the name of secular Judaism. Nothing could be further from the truth. They're actually establishing another secular ideology that is not Jewish. And unfortunately, many American Jews seem comfortable with that possibility. It's just not, it's not really solvable in honesty, because people have drifted so far from their Jewish ethics. I'm sorry that it's true, but it's our job to tell the truth about it.
Kobe, would you like to expand on that or share some of your insights of what you've experienced?
Sure. So I think that, ultimately, again, as I normally don't talk about religion when it comes to other talks. We talk about Iran, we talk about the geopolitical events and challenges that Israel is facing, including the US. But from a perspective, because I'm speaking to this kind of a group, I feel comfortable talking about it. Ultimately, this is a question of a spiritual question. Now, the Jewish people, we have a lot of advantages, but there's a reason why the Jewish people were exiled from the land of Israel. And if you look at history, there are always those who kept religion, who kept the Torah, who kept their faith. And on the other hand, there are those who felt, okay, people hate us because we're Jews. Maybe if we try to be somebody else, maybe they'll accept us. It didn't work. It didn't work in Germany. It didn't work in France. It didn't work in England. The Jewish people were exiled from every country in Europe. When it came to during the Soviet time, Jews decided to leave Judaism and go into communism, and so on and so forth. And now we have this new religion, which is kind of the progressive religion. And if you look at I would say, assimilation rate among the Jewish community in the US, which is around 75%, it basically equals to the amount of to the percentage of people, Jews, who are losing their connection to Israel. There's a direct connection between, there's a generation of the Holocaust, people who are children of Holocaust survivors. So they kind of see Israel as a necessity because this is a place to be where you're Jewish. If something happens in the U.S. or something happens elsewhere, this is our refuge. This is a place of refuge. But their children, the third generation, the fourth generation after the Holocaust, they don't see a reason for Israel anymore, a lot of them. So I think part of our mission also at ZOA is to not necessarily make you religious or make Jewish people religious, but we feel that if we let them know, and again, a lot of it is because of the establishment. I'm an Orthodox Jew. I don't want to talk about any other form of any other movements in Judaism, but I do want to say that there's the Torah the way we got it from Sinai, and those who keep it or believe in it. Okay, we don't keep everything. I'm not perfect. I'm far from being perfect when it comes to religion. But even if I'm doing stuff that is wrong, I know that it's wrong. Now, a lot of Jews and the establishment, the Jewish establishment, are changing the religion. They're calling progressive values. They call it Judaism. That's the problem. Now, just to mention, to touch on the few questions that were said before. I think that it's going to be tough. Things are going to get tougher and harder for Israel and for people of conservative values, I think, before it becomes better. I'm not going to criticize again, like Dan said. We're going to host the Prime Minister of Israel at the ZOA Gala, but the government is not exactly the perfect government that many Israelis thought that they would get. Again, I'm not criticizing Naftali Bennett, just like Dan. I'm not going to veer from that. But what I will say is that if you look at the Arab party in the government right now, in the new coalition, relatively new coalition, the Arab party, believe it or not, has ties to Hamas.
Yes.
And unfortunately, the head of this party, Mansour Abbas, he has a very a way about him where he doesn't say out loud that he wants to destroy the Jewish state, but he does everything behind the scenes. So in Hebrew, he'll speak very nicely, but when it comes to but we just found out that he has people who are tied to his party, who are tied to Hamas. And in fact, there was a family, an Israeli family, a Jewish family that was murdered a few years ago, the Fogel family. Their kids were murdered in their sleep. The parents were murdered in the sleep by a Palestinian terrorist. And I just found out today or yesterday that Mansour Abbas, the head of the Arab party, who is part of the Israeli coalition, offered to pay the murderers of the Jewish family, the Palestinian terrorists. He offered to pay for their legal fees. So this is where we are right now, and I think that you, as non-Jews, most of you here who are non-Jewish, every one of you can be an ambassador. Every one of you, you have your own network of people, and I think that you have a unique opportunity more than us, more than Jewish people, to kind of spread the truth and to talk. If you hear anything about Israel, if you're together with other people and something comes out about Israel, speak up. Every voice counts. So sorry that I spoke for too long, but okay. I think that eventually it's a spiritual struggle. But there is light, because just a few weeks ago we hosted Amichai Shikli. He's an Israeli Jewish Knesset member in one of the ZOA events, and he was talking about the spirit of the Jewish people throughout history, and how regardless of what we face, and we faced many obstacles during history, but essentially the Jewish people in Israel are united, and those who have a clear ideology, we're going to continue. and we're going to make Israel thrive, and we're going to continue this friendship between Israel and between the non-Jewish people who support Israel. And again, as a religious person, I believe that we will win regardless. You know, sometimes God, when it comes to our own private lives and when it comes to generally, sometimes God puts us in a very tough spot. You know, I'm sure every one of you have, you know, sometime in life, you've seen only darkness and you don't know how you would get out of it. But the truth is that as long as we believe in God, we can do it and do our effort. And this is what we do. And the same thing goes to the geopolitical and to the world events, that even though there's a lot of darkness right now, I believe that good will prevail. So thank you.
Thank you, Kobe. Dan, another question. Would you explain or describe the phased plan, please?
Sure. So it's such a great segue because Kobe just spoke about Hebrew and Arabic. It was very famous when Yasser Arafat was entering into negotiations with Israel that became, various, when Israel allowed him to escape Beirut, and Israel brought him back as part of the Oslo plan to Israel and empowered him. And people would give him, from his own side, they would give him a problem, people further, more extreme than him even. And he would answer them in Arabic, and he would tell them what his plan was. And it was the phased plan. And the phased plan was, so it's enunciated and written down in various documents. And it was that Israel, that the Arabs would do terrorist attacks to weaken the will of the Israeli people until the Jews were forced they thought that they would take so many casualties, they would seek to end the conflict by making concessions to the Palestinian Arabs. And the first stage of concessions would be a ceasefire, and the second stage would be taking some territory that the PLO could control. That's now become true, the Palestinian Authority. The third stage, they would continue the conflict from the territory they had liberated. And this is what the Hamas is doing in Gaza, by the way. Israel completely withdrew from Gaza, and they took the territory and they turned it into a base, and they continue to pursue warfare against Israel. And ultimately, this was an answer to people who said, you're only going to settle for a rump state only in the so-called West Bank. And the answer from Yasser Arafat was, no, here's my phased plan to completely defeat Israel. And that all of Israel, from the river to the sea, that's what they say. When you go to a demonstration at the UN or something, the people in keffiyehs, the American leaders, are shouting, from the river to the sea. They mean from the Jordan to the Mediterranean. And then they say, Palestine will be free. They're talking about one state, a state controlled by the Arabs where there are no Jewish national rights. And that is, unfortunately, the phased plan. So I hope that explains what it is. Whoever asked that question, please speak up if I haven't enunciated it to your satisfaction.
That was actually Rob Gottslig.
Yeah, Dan,
who asked that. Go ahead.
that was a great explanation, and that's the best answer to this two-state solution, because it's really part of their phased plan to eliminate Israel as a Jewish state. Excellent, Dan.
Ben has another question, and then I'm going to end with Ben's comment. So I want to give you his question. How confident are you that with the current representation in Congress, the U.S. will continue to remain a strong ally of Israel?
Well, it depends how you grade that alliance. I am very confident that the American-Israel relationship will remain strong. There's almost no doubt, for example, that Iron Dome will be funded. No doubt that military aid to Israel will continue in the next at least 10 years. There's no doubt that the United States and Israel will continue to strategically cooperate on intelligence matters, for example. But it all depends on the specifics, the devil's in the details. The reality is that there's a new event. I've been doing this job for 14 years now in Washington. And when I started, the idea that there would be an element of the Democratic Party that actually wanted this relationship to end would have been laughable. Democrats were supportive of Israel, and you could see that every day in the way that it did. We fought about some things, but not about the basic relationship. Now there is a significant and vocal minority of Democratic on the left, Democratic politicians on the left wing who see it in their interest to sabotage the American-Israel relationship at every step. An example is this Iron Dome vote. What a stupid battle for the enemy to choose. I mean, of all the things, I mean, let's be honest, Israel buys offensive weapons from the United States. They buy bombs, they buy airplanes that are used to go after targets in, Syria all the time. These are all weapons that are supplied by the United States to Israel. What is the one they chose to fight against, though? The purely defensive Iron Dome system that saves Jewish and Arab lives, and that if Israel didn't have them, they would have to retaliate even more often against attacks from Gaza. So it's very strange when you think about them choosing that fight to deny American funding for a weapons system. And what's the reason they did it? It's because it's not really about that particular weapon system. It's about appeasing their own base, which is anti-Israel at its core. And that is a new development. It is very disturbing to those of us who are engaged in the fight on Capitol Hill to not just have to fight, and the same thing we see in this NGO battle. These people are defending the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, who everyone knows are terrorists. And they're defending them. They're choosing a very weird place to pick a fight. These NGOs cooperate and are actually share personnel with a terrorist group. And you would think that congressmen and senators would be ashamed of linking their names to such horrible terrorists. But no, they actually pursue that relationship and are purposefully defending the supposed civil branch of these terrorist groups. It really shows you what we're up against. So yes, I'm confident they'll be pro-Israel. I think we have an increasingly difficult fight, and the bipartisanship that was the characteristic of pro-Israel support when I first came to Washington is completely different today. It is very common to only get Republicans on pro-Israel legislation. It is very common that Democrats pull their punches in the sake and AIPAC for that matter, who we have to be very careful. They do some good work, but they make bipartisanship to be the end goal, when actually the end goal is policy that's pro-Israel. And that's just a fact of things that have changed. So I'm not confident that things are going to get better, because those woke, the left side of the Democratic Party is increasing in its power, and they're unashamedly anti-Israel.
I think that's a great way to end our time together, Dan. First of all, thank you for taking the time to join us. It's been a great evening. Thank you, Shell and Kobe with Michigan ZOA to partner with us. It's been a joy, and we've gained a great deal of information. But I think the challenge for us is how can we be more of an impact for Israel and pro-Israel policy in Washington? How can we help you do your job?
Well, let me say something about that. I thought we were done in a second, but that is a very important question. And the answer here is directly related to the fundraising we've been speaking about. Things that we do in Washington are, everyone has to take a look and see if we're doing everything that we can do to have an impact. And it all returns to resources and activism. So there's different people who have different gifts. Some people have money that they can contribute, and that's great. Other people need to spend the time. I love nothing more than if I am having a meeting with a Michigan senator, you know how much more attention they're going to pay to me if they just received 100 letters that day about this issue of, for example, the consulate in Jerusalem? Do you know how much more effective I can be in my advocacy for Israel if people are taking the time to let their congressmen know how important these issues are to them? It really makes a difference. And that's what I would ask you all to do. Those of you who can contribute both to the groups that are sponsoring this event and ZOA, if you can, that's great. And those of you who have time, that's an even greater contribution. At the end of the day, I think I said it a couple of times already, sometimes Jewish groups think that we are decisive in pro-Israel advocacy. Nothing could be further from the truth. It is Christians who are driving the agenda of our congressional support for Israel and ultimately America's alliance with Israel. Christians who let their congressmen know, Christians who, I'll just tell you a quick story. When former Vice President Pence was in Congress, he represented Indiana. I think you have another great chapter there. And he quite unashamedly, he told the committee that he was serving as a ranking member of, that there is nothing more important to his constituents than the well-being of the state of Israel. And the ranking member, who was a Jewish Democrat from Queens, Congressman Ackerman, he started laughing at him. And he asked him, because he didn't get it. And he asked him how many Jewish people he has in his district again? And the answer was very small. Mike Pence has a very small number of Jewish people in his Indiana district that he represented at the time. But that wasn't the point. And Ackerman didn't get, which was true, is that the reason the Congress is pro-Israel isn't because of the number of Jewish people in the district in Indiana. It's because Christians care. And I want to thank you all for caring. You have to do beyond care. You have to speak up and get involved. So please do.
It's amazing. Thank you so much to each one of you for joining us. In the poll that we took, it's overwhelming that the majority of you joined us tonight as a result of the two organizations who sponsored it, Friends of Israel and the Zionist Organization of America. So from ZOA and Friends of Israel, we say thank you, Toda Rabbah. And I want to conclude our formal time with Ben's comment. It doesn't get better. Thank you, Ben Vasquez. He says, no matter what direction our country takes, as Bible-believing Christians, we will stand with Israel.
Thanks so much. And I'll say to you all, lehitraot, which is Hebrew for we'll see you later.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us. And someone said to talk about Friends of Israel. So at Friends of Israel, you can check us out at our website at www.foi.org. And we have 4 ways to get you to Israel when the gates once again open, and we can join, get that part of our ministry going. One of those is a serving tour for adults. You're there almost 3 weeks, just over 2, between 2 and 3 in Israel. And you're working at Kaplan Medical Center in Rehovot. And we also take young people, young adults there in the summer from for about a month, June to July. And we have the privilege of working there. We also have 2 general tours, one in the spring, one in the fall. If you like warm weather, then go in the summer. If you like spring, if you like cooler weather, go in the spring. But to each one of you, we say thank you. We would remind you to go to mizoa.org to check out the information for the gala coming up in December. It will be available to you online. And to Shell, Kobe, and Daniel, do you have any concluding words for us for tonight?
Just one last plug for the Zionist Organization of America, a gala. It's December 19th at 7 p.m. via Zoom. And as was mentioned, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett will be on it. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo will be on it. These are keynote speakers who will receive awards, as well as Dr. Miriam Adelson, a noted physician and philanthropist.
Thank you, Shel. Kobe.
Yeah, so like I said, I think that we're in a very interesting part of in history. I think that again, most of the last 2,000 years, most of the time of history, the Jewish people have been outside of Israel. But in every generation, first of all, God is with us, and in every generation, there are also the friends of the Jews. And I think that you're on the right side of history. And it's not something to take for granted. And it says in Judaism, it says if you save one person, it's like you save the entire world. So every one of us has a job to do good in the world, represent what God wants from us. As a Jewish person, as a religious person, it's what the Torah says. And everybody in the world, even in Judaism, non-Jews have their own unique role to play. So really, from me to you, thank you, and continue to support us, and we'll continue to be there for you as well. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you
for everything that you do.
Thank you, Dan. Last word.
I just want to say thanks for the opportunity I'm always buoyed by this kind of group's reactions, and thank you all. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Chris. Very nice meeting you all.
Thank you. And to everyone, we welcome you, and we look forward to the next time we get to be together. And I'd like to end with that great saying, Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel.
Hi.
Thank you. Hi.
Bye.
Am Yisrael Chai. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
God bless you. Good night.
God bless you all.